So this is a nice little paper that talks about the climate resilience of European wine regions. Uh, you know, uh, Wine grapes require very particular temperatures through the season and overall, and relates to humidity levels, frost conditions, and so on and so forth. So Europe, the mainland, which is now, which has been traditionally a producer of a lot of wine, good wine, sorry about that, good wine, now is facing warming, so the wine producing regions are moving north or will continue to move north. UK is getting better and better at wine production now. Same thing is happening in the US, California versus northern states, and so on and so forth. So this study basically looked at how these things are changing and what needs to happen to protect them or make them climate resilient. Over centuries, European vintners have developed a profound knowledge about grapes, environment, and techniques that yield the most distinguishable wines. In many regions, this knowledge is reflected in the system of wine geographical indicators, or GI. But climate change is challenging this historical union. Here we present a climate change vulnerability assessment of 1,085 wine GIs across Europe and propose climate resilient development pathways using an ensemble of biophysical and socioeconomic indicators. Results indicate that wine regions in southern Europe are among the most vulnerable, with high levels also found in Eastern Europe. Vulnerability is influenced by the rigidity of the GI system, which restricts grape variety diversity and thus contributes to an increased sensitivity to climate change. Contextual deficiencies such as limited socioeconomic resources may further contribute to increased vulnerability. Building a climate resilient wine sector will require rethinking the GI system by allowing innovation to compensate for negative effects of climate change. Okay, this is big business, and of course the French are very particular about what name can be used by who. You remember the controversy over every sparkling wine being called champagne, whereas Champagne is a region in France, and the French said you cannot produce champagne unless you produce it in Champagne. So that got settled by calling many things as sparkling wines instead of champagnes. Champagne, right? The concept of geographical indication indicator GI plays an essential role in defining a wine's identity and establishing a strong link between the product's unique characteristics and its provenance, the origin. Indeed, many of the world's most famous wines are known for their origin and not for their grape variety. The system of classifying and regulating wines based on their origin is commonly referred to as geographical indication, or GI, and the strictest rules can be found in Europe, where premium GI wines are labeled as protected destination of origin, PDO. These wines can only be produced in legally defined areas that have been selected based on soil type, climate, and historical or administrative divisions. The presence of both human and natural dimensions in defining wine regions is related to the historic concept of terroir, French, an originally French notion that states that the place, both the land with its climate and people, defines the product. Climate change is increasingly impacting several aspects of viticulture, including vine phenology, grape composition, and growing sustainability. These biophysical changes require growers and producers to adapt by employing new cultivation techniques, using new varieties, or shifting cultivating locations. However, the legal rigidity of the GI system can impair the ability of wine regions to adapt and to preserve traditional wine production in the context of climate change, i.e., GI resilience. For example, Burgundy and Champagne are known for wines made from Pinot Noir, a varietal. If these regions become unable to grow typical Pinot Noir grapes at some point, they are under serious threat. A substitute wine variety would neither qualify for the label, nor would the law permit growers to source grapes from outside the regions, and or introduce new cultivation techniques without going through the process of amending the wine region's regulations themselves. In many wine regions, increasing resilience will therefore depend on adaptation strategies that overcome traditional and legislated practices by including more flexibility to better support the sustainable development of winemaking in uncertain climate. So we are merging climate change problems, impacts on soil, climate, temperature, humidity, and the administrative structure historically set up for this very valuable commercial business of wine production and labeling, right? We'll just run through some nice figures. So exposure low to high here, this is about exposure and sensitivity to climate change of European wine GIs. As you know, risk is defined as a multiplier of hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and now response has been added. So this is just exposure. There is usually a definition behind it which you can go and read. So here is Canary Islands and other places, but you see Europe here, and high exposure are in these reddish colors, as we said, Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, and it's a mix. So low vulnerability here, low vulnerability around here, moderate vulnerability around here, and so on. Sensitivity again high and medium and low. So very wide distribution. So if you look at the regions, let's read the caption. A and B are maps of climate change exposure and sensitivity of the European wine geographical indications. The regions are indicated by their geographical center. Dark gray areas are the background. Dark gray areas in the background represent mountain regions made with natural earth, free vector, and raster map data. C is historical histogram showing the distribution of HI, CNI, and DI for periods 1981 to 2010 and 1971 to 2100 under the scenario shared socioeconomic pathway 370 or 3.7 scenario of all wine regions. Let's see, these are the GIs, HI, CNI, and DI, which you can look up. Okay, so 2 periods, and you can see how things will shift as you go from 1981 to 2010 to this should be 2071 to 2100, not 1971. So you shift the mean and the tail and the so on, so counts for each GI, and similarly here you are looking at sensitivity and in these regions. So this is the sensitivity of European wine GIs related to the share of varieties with potential positive effects from climate change for each PDO under SSP 370 scenario and for the period of 2041 to 2070, considering 3 bioclimatic indices. So some details, but essentially the main message I would like you to take out of this is that they have done a good job of finding quantitative metrics for exposure and sensitivity to climate change, and they are saying how they will change in the coming years and decades and what it will mean for managing this GI business that has been set up over historical periods since the, let's say, Industrial Revolution at least. Wine regions have long, several centuries of good data on temperature, humidity, and so on, and many people have done some analysis on those. Indicators of adaptive capacity they used include social, physical, natural, human, and financial. And indicators typically include things like aging index, dependency ratio, population density, road length, mechanization index, naturalness, debt ratio, return on assets, subsidy dependence, and so on. which gives you a good sense of their exposure, vulnerability, risk, etc. So the lack of variety specific information, including their spatial distribution and phenological characteristics, their seasonality, poses a significant limitation to our capacity to estimate future impacts of climate change in GIs. For instance, there is a very large diversity of phenological characteristics among different vine varieties, VINE, so it's a grape plants, but detailed variety specific knowledge is mostly limited to international varieties, representing approximately 1% of global vine diversity. This only covers a very small proportion of the more than 1,000 varieties currently listed for the European PDO regions, and so on. Okay, so there are complications on how you would want to change the system and move to a more a different system that is responsive to climate impacts. So adaptive capacity to climate change is considered. I am skipping a lot of details, by the way. To adapt and cope with climate change, GI regions need access to resources which enable and facilitate the implementation of adaptation strategies. The adaptive capacity indicates the readiness and potential of a region to adapt to climate change. To assess the adaptive capacity of the European wine regions, we identified 5 crucial dimensions which characterize the ability of wine regions to counteract the negative effects of climate change. 1. Financial dimension, describing financial situation of farms specialized in viticulture in the region. Secondly, the natural dimension, reflecting the topoclimatic diversity within a region. These hills with their soil qualities and specific winter humidity levels and frost temperatures are very important for the quality of the wine and the region specificity. Thirdly, the physical dimension, describing the presence of infrastructure and physical assets of viticulture. Thirdly, social and human dimensions. Let me pause because I have a knock on the sorry, I have to deal with the cleaning person coming in. Working from home has advantages and disadvantages, right? So we are looking at the dimensions of adaptive capacity. We looked at financial dimension, natural dimension, physical dimension, and also looking at social and human dimensions, which are related to population characteristics such as age structure or employment and education, as well as available labor force within wine regions. We considered a total of 15 indicators of adaptive capacity that together estimate the potential of wine regions to adapt to climate change. For more detailed information, go to supplementary material and so on. And I'm not, the table talked about this here, so just follow up on that. Okay. So here is another figure showing adaptive capacity of the European wine GIs. So the adaptive capacity dimensions are shown as well. So what are the actions needed? Adaptive capacity scores. This is the adaptive capacity from low to high. So the highly impacted regions obviously have low adaptive capacity as well, but there are some that have high adaptive capacities, but you have to then look at what may be needed in the dimensions. So these are social, natural, financial, physical and human dimensions. And you can see there are shift in required actions could be or adaptive capacity measured as shift in space, naturalness, mechanization index, road length, so transportation issues, debt ratio, financial issues, education level, social and socioeconomic issues, availability of climatic niches with climate change, water availability and so on. And here you are looking at various wine varietals like Prosecco, regions, Alsace, Rheinhessen, which is in Germany, producing good Riesling, I suppose, Douro, La Mancha, and Alto Adige. So all European regions throughout these belts, and it's talking about how they are doing in each dimension of adaptive capacity score. Obviously, it depends. So here they are, some of these are high capacity in these in terms of population density, dependent ratio, and aging index. So aging population is overall a big problem for the European Union, but how that affects the wine region vulnerability has to be understood. So climate resilient wine growing, then the integrated vulnerability index of the wine regions is determined by the combination of their exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, and indicates their susceptibility to the adverse impacts of climate change, which we will see in a minute. By analyzing the combined effect of these three indicators, it's possible to identify groups of regions with similar characteristics and give insights into potential pathways towards a more climate resilient wine sector. Just to read off a bit more, 5% of European wine regions have a very high integrated vulnerability index, that is group 6. They are likely to face the strongest negative impacts within the next few decades due to their high levels of exposure and sensitivity and their limited resources for adaptation. Okay, so let's keep that in mind and look at this figure here. Remember that there are uncertainties in climate projections themselves. So you are taking that as an input here and doing all these other vulnerability indices, exposure, sensitivity, etc. The uncertainty in those indices is subsumed into these analysis, not separately dealt with. So vulnerability here going from low to high, and depends on exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So the scores here you can see low vulnerability looks like in quite a few regions, but there is sliding into high vulnerability in some other regions. And if you look again into different groups based on these exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, group 6 is the most vulnerable. I won't go into the details, but you can see they're all in different ranges here. Okay, so that then gives you the more PDOs per vulnerability level for different GIs, and I won't go into the details again, but you are looking at low, moderate, high, low, moderate sensitivity, high here is low, moderate exposure, and very high, which is combination of all of those. Okay, so gives you a sense that the analysis is very useful and region specific, so that they can take actions to the extent that these are rich people and they are paying attention to these things because they see the changes firsthand and they want to protect their businesses. So they will be very sensitive to understanding what is possible in terms of making their wine production climate resilient. Will that allow them to also change their GI system? Well, that's not clear because that's hardly a climate change problem. That's a socio-economic, market, financial problem, and so on. So overall, the individual characteristics of each group, such as the varietal diversity, availability of resources for adaptation, or the magnitude of expected changes in climatic conditions, will determine the future development and the climate resilience of these wine regions. Okay, so let's read the discussion just to conclude. Adaptation strategies generally need to be chosen on a region-specific basis, as they depend on the individual characteristics of each region. In general, however, most GIs will aim to maintain the identity and characteristics of the wines for which they are known today, also under future conditions. Based on the integrated vulnerability index of the European wine regions combined with the results from previous studies, it is therefore possible to outline some potential future pathways for the European wine sector. These can help identify sound adaptation options and increase the resilience of the GI system. So you want to maintain the system, make it resilient against climate change, but you want to remember not only the limitations in terms of how much you can control climate change locally versus or globally versus what your socio-economic and other vulnerabilities are. For instance, adjustment of viticultural processes has been shown to compensate for a change in climatic conditions up to a certain degree and might thus be useful for regions with high exposure levels. This includes strategies such as canopy management, use of irrigation, modification of vineyard structure, selection of rootstocks, or the use of cover crops. I've shown the trend map, global warming trend map of surface temperatures in many podcasts. You can go back and look at them. The Middle East into the Mediterranean region is warming the fastest on land. Arctic warms the fastest because of polar amplification, but these regions we are talking about are warming very rapidly. Obviously, there is a strong motivation to keep the warming to a minimal level. So they can be used, these methods that we mentioned, irrigation, modification of vineyard structure and so on, can be used to modify the interactions between vines and the environment, for example, uptake of water and nutrients, or to directly alter microclimatic conditions in vineyards, such as exposure to incoming radiation with canopy covers, and thus can reduce negative effects from climate change. In the case of high sensitivity levels, adjusting wine blend ratios and compositions or gradually introducing new varieties could be promising options to mitigate potential changes in grape composition and wine style. This is, for example, currently occurring in the regions of Bordeaux, where new varietals have been added to the production regulations and are being tested extensively. The strongest climate impacts will be found in regions with both high exposure and sensitivity, which may lead to significant shifts in product characteristics. In extreme cases, adaptation measures that go beyond vineyard management, such as site relocation to new climatic conditions, may be necessary, moving the vineyard itself. However, the scope of such adaptation measures often entails a partial or complete departure from traditional production regulations and might also strongly change the characteristics of the resulting product. Early warning and awareness are therefore critical to successful implementation and to providing the necessary support to prepare eventual amendments in these regions. Really nice work that puts it together. There is some thing about prospects for further research. Just I will touch on it. European wine PDO regions encompass a remarkable blend of climates, economies and traditions. As such, they show substantial differences in many aspects of exposure, sensitivity and adaptive capacity, and the related sub-indicators that shape the integrated vulnerability index of each region. Okay, so important implications for future research. Of course, detailed recommendations for improving climate resilience must also consider regional differences in the weight of each indicator and in their combination. This would include an accurate and robust assessment of key variables that are shaping the integrated vulnerability index, such as the response of individual varieties to climate change based on phenological models. Other region-specific characteristics should also be analyzed in greater detail, such as the choice of rootstock type, management of the inner row vegetation, or the use of a specific training system. Many wine regions as we know them today will change, while the historical concept of terroir I'm not pronouncing it correctly, terroir emphasizes the specific roles of nature and people in defining wine regions. Adaptation to climate change necessitates flexibility. The GI system must find a way to adapt to climate change and increase its potential for innovation while still preserving the connection between terroir and consumers. Okay, so just a brief introduction. It's a nice paper that I've condensed into a small introduction for you, so you can go back and follow up if you are interested. Okay.